Hello everyone. Welcome to Feature Supportability Training for Clarity 16.2.2. This is Denise Saladay and I'll be covering the topic of usability improvements for grid and filtering. So what is new this release in the grid and filtering area? First, for filtering, we have the ability now where you can reorder and reorganize filter groups and filter chips. And if you have a filter chip that's inactive, we're changing the coloring of that so you can see that it's not active. We've also introduced a new capability called conditional formatting, which will be applied in the grids. And we'll look at how you can create, edit, delete, and copy these conditional formatting roles in your saved views. We'll also look at the application of these roles in the grids. And last, we'll look at how conditional formatting is impacted whenever you change any attributes. You make them active, inactive, or you delete them, and hierarchy metrics and pick lists are changed. We'll look and see at some of the implications. In my demonstration, we'll take a look at how you can reorganize filter groups and filter chips, and then we'll take a look at what inactive filters will look like. We will also create, modify, delete, and copy conditional formatting roles that will be applied to grids. We'll view the application of those roles in the grids, and last, we'll understand any impacts to conditional formatting when you have dependent attributes and metrics and pick lists whenever they're deactivated and or deleted. Now we'll take a look in clarity at the changes that we made in filtering. And we're looking here at the project's grid. You can see that I have 3 different filter groups here. And what's new is now the filter groups have drag handles. So now we can reorder them. So if you just drag them up until you see the line, you can reorder them as follows. You can also reorder any filter chips that you have within a group. Let's change this order. We'll make active first. What you can also do is you can move filter chips across groups. So I'll move this one up here. What you can't do is nest filter groups underneath other nested filter groups. And you might wonder what would happen if you had 2 separate chips here for primary stakeholder, for example. So if I already had one in the top filter group, and let's say that primary stakeholder was Cheryl Amos, and down here it's Patrick Clark. If I was to move this chip into the first filter group, where there already was a filter chip for primary stakeholder, even though the value is different, what would happen in this scenario is it would not move the filter chip. So Patrick Clark would still remain in the third filter group, and the original filter chip for Cheryl Amos for the primary stakeholder would remain in the first filter group. Any existing behavior that we had for filters still remains unchanged in this release. For example, if you add empty filter groups, we're not auto-deleting them. The user would have to delete them if they're empty. And the maximum number of chips that you can have in any one filter group still is unchanged. And any changes that you make to your filters still can be saved within your saved view. And anytime that you add new filter chips, it's going to add them to the end of your filter group by default. And the last point is these changes that we made for filters are available in places where we support filters today in Clarity, like in header filters, widgets, business roles, and in staffing. And you may have noticed that we have two gray filter chips. And this is a change that we made this release as well. The reason these are gray is because these are inactive filters. You can see that both the work status and the project type don't have any values for conditions for them, so they're not really active filters within this view that we're looking at. And what we've done is any inactive filters are gray now. And last release they were blue, the same as the active filter chips that are still blue. And it's important to note that the counter on the filter chips is the same as it was last release. It still counts both inactive and active filter chips. Now we'll take a look in Clarity at the new capability for conditional formatting. We're in the project workspace, and you can see that there's a new icon here for conditional formatting. Now this icon's not available anywhere else except on grids, so when you're in the timeline or the board view, you're going to see it disabled. Additionally, it's disabled and not available in the canvas, the details flyout expanded grid, tree and nested grids, storing bulk edits, new from template, any selection modals or any other modals that you're using, investment staff module, in the add staff button, those grids that appear there, in the grid when you're adding tasks to timesheets, resource directory, staffing workspace, it's not available, except in the staff tab. There's a grid there where it is available. And it's not available in audit under administration. Conditional formatting is a capability that allows users to build formatting in their grid based on specific conditions. And they can create up to 20 formatting roles for each of their save view. So if you click on the conditional formatting icon, you can see that this is the place where you would add your conditional formatting roles. By default, you get a blank role, and each role essentially has 3 different categories of data that you need to populate. And the first one is you would need to define your condition for the formatting. The second thing you need to define is what type of format that you want to apply for your role. And the last thing that you'll define is what it applies to. It'll either be a specific attribute in your grid or a column, or it'll be the entire row in your grid. There's also some action buttons, and we'll go into these in more depth later, but note that the first one is what designates your role as either active or inactive. And notice by default that your roles are enabled. Second action button is copy, and the last one is the trash can if you want to delete your formatting role. Notice at the bottom of your modal, there's also a cancel and apply button. And the apply button will become active whenever you have a valid condition. And in order to have a valid role, you need to have a valid condition. Any new roles that you'd want to create, you would do that by clicking the new role button. And notice that it's added at the top. And you can collapse or expand your roles by clicking on that button. Let's work now on creating our role condition. You go in here and select Add a Condition. We'll just add one to Work Status. And you don't have a valid condition until you have both the attribute that you want to use as well as the value that you apply to it. And once you have that, you've got a valid role. You can see that the Apply button is active again, and by default the format is no formatting. It applies to the entire row. If I wanted to add another condition, and I did not enter any criteria for this condition, what would happen is as soon as I clicked Apply, this condition would get removed. If this role didn't have any valid conditions that would have both the attribute and the condition value, that means it's not a valid role, so during the apply operation it would delete the role and wouldn't save it. That would apply to both new roles and existing roles. So the attributes that are available, we'll remove this invalid role. The attributes that are available in the set conditions are string, number, lookup, MVLs, Boolean, date, money, URLs, TSV totals, but not the per period metrics. Can use calculated, aggregated calculated, hierarchy calculated, and aggregated, formula, and OBS, unit only, and pick list. So you can pick any of those values here as a condition. For the attribute list that you have available here, for the object, you have the same attributes that you have available in filters for the object, except for the starred attribute, and then on task, assign resource attribute is not available, and TSV per period. Each role that you have here could have a maximum of 20 different conditions that you can use, and all those conditions must be either all of them all or any. And in a single role, you can only add one attribute once in your condition. So I already have work status, but as you can see, if I try to go and add work status again, it's not even in my list to add. Next, we'll work on the formatting for this conditional formatting role. What's nice about this is there's actually a preview window where you can view your format instantly without having to inactivate it and view it in the grid. So if we click the drop down here, you can see that you can do some easy text format here. You can bold it, put it in italics, underline. You can have a strike through, and you can also have background color. You can see that instantly. And you just pick any color you want. You can see the changes here. The clear format button's available, which will just bring you back to the default and remove all formatting. And once you're done, you just click Done. There's also text formatting, where you can select a color of formatting that you want. The automatic button here is smart in the sense that if you have defined, let me demonstrate that, if you have a dark color, it'll automatically pick white because it knows how dark it is that you need light text. And if you turn that off, you can pick whatever you want here, whatever color you want. You can see that it's changing. And if you set it back to automatic, it goes back to the preferred option, and you can clear all formatting by clicking this as well. So let's go back for this particular role, and what I want to do is set the background color, and we'll click Done. There's a couple of things that I want to bring up here on the formatting. One is when you have an attribute that you're putting and applying a format on that is a display mapping, you'll see when you're using the entire row, you'll see that both the column and the row will be applied together, and we'll look at that shortly. Even if you picked a column here to apply this format to on a value with display mapping, it's going to combine them both, and we'll look at more examples of that later on in my demonstration. But it's important to note that you can't use both underline and strike through at the same time because they're mutually exclusive. And if you have separate business roles for work statuses that are identical with the same conditions and everything, but the only difference is one underlines and one strike through, what will happen is the priority will be underline. If you have any Boolean attributes, they cannot have any text formatting applied, and by that I mean bold, italics, underline, strike through, and font color. Those are text formats. Conditional formatting also will not change the font color of any attributes that have a link, because in the product we have special treatment for linked attributes. So you can change how the font looks, bold, italics, but you can't change the color of the font. And if you have any attributes with display mappings like work status here, for example, the only thing that would really work if I was going to apply that treatment to the work status column here, italics is the only thing that I could do to it because it's using the normal display mapping badge that you would see. So for this example, let's click Done, and the only formatting that we're applying is the background color, and we've chosen this color. So the next thing that we'll take a look at in our conditional formatting rule is the two options that we have. By default it's set to entire row, but you could select any attribute that you want here that's available. And it can even be a different attribute than attributes that you're using in the condition. Like I could pick the project name, for example, to be formatted based on this condition. And this is a single select value, so I can only apply formatting to either one attribute or the entire row. The attributes that are available here in our list are the same attributes that would be available for the object in the column picker, except for the start attribute, and if it's a task object, the assigned resources attribute, and per period TSVs. And to summarize, the types of attributes that are supported here for 2 are string, number, lookup, MVLs, booleans, date, money, URL, TSV totals, not TSV per period, calculated attributes, aggregated, calculated, hierarchy, calculated and aggregated, formula, OBS, pick lists, and attachments. So I'll finish this rule here. I still want it to apply for work status on hold this background color for the entire row. You can see the apply button is enabled, and to activate this rule I would just need to click apply. As soon as I do so, you can see in my view here that I have, and again these conditional formats are saved along with my saved view. I'll just save them again here. You can see that the formatting is instantly applied. I have two projects where the work status is on hold, and you can see that the background color changed to my formatting preference. I've added an assortment to new roles in my project grid. This is the one we were looking at before for the work status on hold, just so you can see some examples of some things that you can do with formatting. Here I have a compound condition based on a value of a metric, and I'm making the project name bold. Here I have a condition based on strategic theme, where I'm making the strategic theme both bold and a different font color. Up here I have another compound condition based on the current date with a calculation of 30 days for the go live date, and I'm changing the go live date to a background color of like a maroon color. And last I have another role where I'm setting the corporate priority background color for that attribute dark green if it's a high priority. And this is what my grid looks like with all 5 of those conditional formatting rules applied. And I want to bring your attention to what it looks like when you have an attribute with display mappings, but you're setting a background color for that same attribute. You can see that it combined them and it applied them both here. And the same thing happens whenever you have conditional formatting on a row that also has display mapping here for on hold. You can see that I have some condition formatting created here for strategic theme, and I also have my project bolded here for another condition. So if we change this grid to have a group by, we'll do work status because we already have a role built on work status. So as you can see here, the groups themselves do not have any formatting, but it still applies the conditions and any formatting to the rows within that group. And as a reminder, all of these conditions are saved with the view. So what that means is within the product we have other grids that are selection grids, and they share saved views with other workspaces in the product. So because these formatting rules are saved with the view, that means that you might see some selection grids that share views with views that are already formatted, and they'll also be formatted as well, just like the grid is. So that formatting will be applied everywhere that that shared view is used. And one example of that could be whenever you're importing investments into the hierarchy. And because cost plans and budget plans share save views in Clarity, that means that any conditions that you build in your save views, if you're any views that are shared across both of those, will also have the same conditional formatting. It's also worth noting that a selected row in a grid cannot show both the selected treatment and the conditional formatting background color. So if we go and we select this row here, you can see that the selected treatment is blue, but the original formatting treatment was like a light beige color. You don't have to display the attribute in your grid to see the formatting. So let's deselect work status. As you can see, we have this like the light orange color, and see what happens. So that was the criteria, and you can see that even though we're no longer showing work status, we still have formatting for that row. If it was formatting a different column in the row, say manager, instead of the whole row, even though we're not showing the work status, the manager would still be formatted. But as you would expect, if you were to not display this go live date, you wouldn't see any formatting that's specific to this column because it's not displayed in the grid. Conditional formatting is not supported at all within mobile. Next, we'll take a look at some conditional formatting rules that are applied against non-period metrics. So if you look here, I have two rules created. One is if ETC is greater than 100, to change the entire row to red, italics, underlined. And if the allocation is greater than 1400, then change the allocation to like a dark purple with a white background. And you can see when these rules are applied, that's what's happening. The allocation column is dark purple when it's over 1400, and when the ETC is over 100, it's formatting the entire row in a red underlined italics format. In a different save view in the same workspace, I have a different conditional formatting rule. If the allocation is greater than 1400 hours, then I will change the entire row to dark green. One thing I want to point out though is whenever you're creating conditional formatting rules, notice that you have per period metrics available. You also have them available in your drop-down list for the to column. But these metrics are not supported. So you want to select non-per period metrics, which is what I have here. And when you apply that rule to this save view, notice that anything with allocation greater than 1400 is highlighted green. And the other thing you should note is that the total row is not formatted. Conditional formatting rules are applied in priority order. And you can change the priority by using these drag and drop handles by reorganizing your formatting rules. And notice that I have an example here in the project workspace of some background formatting where if the corporate priority is empty, I want to turn the entire row green, and if the go live date is empty, I want to turn the entire row purple. Now, whenever you have color formatting, whether it's background coloring or font coloring, it's really important that you have your rules prioritized correctly, because whichever one is the highest priority is going to take priority, because naturally you can't have background colors, two colors at the same time, and the same thing with a font color. It can only be one color at a time. So let's take a look at what this formatting looks like in the grid. You can see that whenever the corporate priority is null, that the row is green in every case, because it was our number one priority role. And note that if the go live date is null, it can be purple. And in the case of the second to last row, notice that it's the only row that's purple because the corporate priorities actually populated. So that's the only time that the second rule triggered. In another example in the project workspace, we're going to look at role prioritization when we're using different font styles. Now notice that these three conditional formatting rules are all formatting the finish date. The first one is if the corporate priority is empty, it's bold. Second one, if the go live date is empty, it's italics. And if work status is not equal to active, it's underlined. It's important to note that font style formatting, and by that I mean bold, italics, underline, and strike through, are treated as additive formats. So what that means is if the first rule is met, finish date's going to be bold. The second rule is met, it will be italics. If the first and the second rule is met, it's going to be both bold and italics. And if all three rows are met, it's going to be bold, italics, and underlined. Be aware, though, that underline and strike through are mutually exclusive formats, so they can't coexist at the same time. So if rules are applicable and use both of those, the underline is going to win. This is what our grid will look like after these rules are applied. And notice that the finish date has multiple different formats. In some cases, it's just underlined. In others, it's italics and underlined. And sometimes it's even all three, like DPM Loan App Release 5.0, where all three rules were triggered. Next, I'll demonstrate how we apply field level security in conditional formatting. Notice that I have a save view here in the project workspace, and corporate priority has field level security. And this resource who's logged in right now has access to this attribute. And let's look and see the conditional formatting rules that I have applied using that attribute. Notice that each one of these rules has a condition criteria using the corporate priority attribute. One of them is by itself, the other two are compound ones. And notice that in the to column that I'm applying these rules against different things. One is against the entire row, one is directly against the corporate priority attribute, and another one's against the primary stakeholder. And I have different formats here that I'm applying. I have a maroon bold font, a purple background, and a bold italic font. And if we look at this grid in the formatting, you can see that we have some instances of bold italics and the dark maroon colored primary stakeholders, as well as the corporate priority has some purple background. Now I'm logged in as a different user who does not have access to the corporate priority secured attribute, and it's the same view that we were just looking at before. Now notice that because this user doesn't have access to the corporate priority attribute, that any conditions that were built using that were removed. The top row only had the one condition by itself, but the other two were compound, and you can see that the corporate priority conditions were removed and the other two were left. Also notice that because each one of these rules used the corporate priority attribute, that for this user, it inactivated all 3 conditional formatting roles. And one of these roles had the to field set as the corporate priority attribute. And notice that it changed it to be entire row. And because this user doesn't have access to that attribute and all of these roles are now inactive, note that in their grid, for the same view, they're not seeing any formatting at all. Because only enabled roles are applied for conditional formatting in the grid. Now, we'll review modifying conditional formatting roles. I have an example here in the project workspace, and note that all of the roles that I have created are active. And you can modify conditional formatting roles regardless of whether they're active or inactive. So all you really need to do is go in and make any changes that you want to make. You can create new roles, you could modify existing roles, you could change the formatting, you could change any of the to values, you could make something inactive, you could delete any of the roles, you could make any of these changes. And as soon as you do make a change, it will have the apply button is active. And remember, whenever you're building conditions, that you have to have complete conditions. So if I don't enter a condition, the rest of the condition here, as soon as I click apply, it's going to delete this part of the role. And if this role didn't have any valid conditions, it would delete the entire role. And whenever you're done with the changes that you want to make, you can just click apply, or you could click cancel to cancel them. And any changes that you make will be immediately reflected in your Save View grid. And of course, only those conditional formatting rules that are active will have the formatting applied. Using the same example here, you can disable or delete rules. What I'll do is disable one of them and delete another one, just to show you how that's done. So I'll inactivate this one and I'll delete this one. And all the rules that will be applied will be these 3 because this one is disabled. And when you're done with that, you would just click apply. You can see whenever the grid is refreshed that the formatting for those 2 items was removed. And sometimes when you're making a lot of changes to your conditional formatting rules, you may need to do a hard refresh, but a lot of the times it will refresh on its own. You can also copy business rules. Anytime that you do create a copy of a conditional formatting rule, it'll create it right underneath the one that you're copying from. And notice that this one was inactive and it copied it as inactive, so I'm going to change that to active. I'm just going to make a couple of changes here. I'm going to just add a condition here for the go live date. If it's empty, I'm going to set the background to, I'll make it that purple color again, the one I deleted. And when you're done, you just click apply. And as you can see, that my corporate priority is purple, it's inactive, and if I want to change that to something other, my go live date is empty, I had the corporate priority turning. So let me change this one as well. Now the go live date will. When you copy a saved view, it also copies the conditional formatting rules with it. And recall that I have one inactive here, and I have 4 other active roles, and they're in this priority. They'll be copied whether they're disabled or not, and they'll be copied exactly the way they are here in the same order. So if we create a new saved view here, see that we're using the new view. You can see that we have our business roles here. First one inactive. We have 4 other roles in the same order that are active. And the new view is formatted identically as our original copy based on the conditional formatting rules in this view. Next, we'll take a look at what will happen if you have a metric that you created for hierarchies and you had conditional rules based on it and you deleted your metric. So as you can see here, under Manage Metrics, I have an attribute metric created called Amount Distributed for this hierarchy, and I have it displayed here in my grid, and it does have some conditional formatting. And if we review that, notice that I have it used in each one of these conditions. This one is a compound condition where if the work status equals active and this amount is greater than 3 million, then I want to turn green italics the font color for the entire row. Otherwise, my role priority number 2 is if that amount is greater than 1 million, I want to change only that column, amount distributed, to dark green. So we'll go into the metric and we'll remove it. Okay, let's look at what happened to our conditional formatting rules. First, notice that any conditions that were built using that attribute that we just deleted, the metric, that it removed them. Here on the left side, one of them was a compound condition and the other one was not. Also notice that the attribute that had formatting on the amount distributed metric has been changed to entire row. But what's even more important to notice about this is any conditional formatting rules that use the metric that we just deleted in either the condition or in the to column, once you delete that metric, it makes these changes, but it even disables each one of your conditional formatting rules. So notice here that they're both disabled. So if we re-enable these rules, what will happen is this one here really isn't a valid role anymore because it doesn't have a condition. So as soon as you click apply, the only role that will be left is this one here, and it'll be based on work status. So if we go back in, you can see that that was true, and it did remove this role, and it's applying it to the entire row, and it's active. So we should be able to see that change here for work status, where it's dark green italics the entire row. and this is displaying correctly. So if you had pick lists, for example, in roadmaps, and you did the same use case here where you removed a pick list that was used in conditional formatting rules, the behavior would be identical as what you've seen here with hierarchy metrics. The last thing that I want to demonstrate is what happens to conditional formatting whenever you delete or deactivate attributes in Classic Studio. In the project workspace, I have a save view that has conditional formatting based on the funding level. If the funding level is empty, I have italics red font for the entire row. I also have the funding level attribute background for that column highlighted in yellow. And if the funding level is not empty and the business alignment is empty, I have bold font for the entire row. And if the manager is empty and the funding level is not empty, I have a red background on the manager field. And you can see here that all of those roles are applied in my Save View grid. So if we go into Classic Studio, we're going to deactivate this attribute. After refreshing my grid, notice that there is no longer any conditional formatting applied. Now if we take a look at what happened to the roles for conditional formatting for this grid, you can see that every one of these roles was deactivated because every one of them used the funding attribute in their role. Any of the roles that had the funding attribute in the condition, notice that the condition part of that role is deleted. And likewise in the to column, if any of the columns were the funding attribute, that was changed to be the entire row. You would see this exact same behavior if I had deleted the attribute instead of deactivated it. If I was to click Apply on these roles, it would remove, during the apply operation, any invalid rules, which would be the top two because they don't have valid conditions. So you'd be left with your last two roles, and if you wanted to, you could reactivate them and apply that formatting. But let's say that you made a mistake in deactivating this attribute in Studio and you want to reactivate it. So I don't want to delete any of these roles because I made a mistake, so I'm just going to close this window. And I'll go back into Studio and I'm going to correct my mistake and reactivate this attribute. After I refresh the screen, look what happened. All of my conditional formatting is here again. I have bold rows and some red backgrounds when the manager's null for those two formats. And I also have italics red. But what I need to do is I need to add the funding level attribute back into my grid for my Save View because it was removed when I deactivated it. And note in the case when it was null that the background was changing to yellow for this role as well. So if we take a look at the roles here, you can see that as long as I didn't apply to cancel and save any of these before I reactivated the attribute, you can see that my roles are back in the same exact state that they were in before. They're all active, and where they apply to the attribute itself, funding level, or even a different attribute, or the whole row, that was put back into its original state. And you can see that all of my conditions are here, whether they're single conditions or compound conditions. And all of the formatting was applied here. And this concludes the usability improvements topic on grid and filtering. Thank you.